Hi everyone, my name is Kevin Levache. I'm a research scientist working at IBM Research. Among other things, my research focuses on investigating new types of adversarial AI attacks and defenses. And the work I'm going to be presenting today is some of the research carried out by myself and my colleagues Ambrish Rawat and Matthew Zinn. So the research we've been investigating lately focuses on DGMs, or Deep Generative AI models. In particular, we were interested in looking into whether these AI models have any adversarial weaknesses which haven't been discovered yet and which could be potentially exploited by attackers. So this is a dimension of AI robustness which hasn't been explored very much until now. Most adversarial AI research typically focuses on models performing classification tasks, and there's a lot less research right now looking at DGMs. So we thought we'd investigate this area a bit more to see if we could find any new forms of security vulnerabilities in that space. So in case you're not familiar with deep generative models, they're an emerging AI technology which is starting to become very popular, and it's rapidly been adopted across many industries. They're AI models that can synthesize samples in high-dimensional data manifolds from specific latent representations. So concretely, this means that they're a form of AI models which can produce samples which look very realistic. And in the example here, you have, for example, images generated by a popular model called StyleGAN, which consists of images of faces of humans who do not exist. So these people you're seeing here are completely fake people. Nevertheless, their picture looks impressively realistic. And deep generative models today can produce samples in many forms, not just images. So you have the equivalent now being produced for music, text, audio of various forms, video, even complex relational data or molecular structures. And they have applications in various industries. So these days you can find them in the media industry. I'm aware that in the healthcare industry they're already being used to 3D print personalized medical prostheses. And in the fashion and construction industry, they're also used to synthesize new designs on demand. So the point is that these models are very fast becoming incorporated in many product pipelines. So how do you use a DGM? At a very high level, the simplest forms of DGMs work the following way. Once a DGM is trained, the only thing that is needed by the user basically is to generate a random vector. This is then input in the DGM as a latent representation and mapped to a specific location on the DGM's manifold. And from this location, a high-dimensional sample is then produced. And if you introduce a different vector, you'll get a different sample. So from the point of view of a user, it's pretty straightforward to use. So then what's the problem with DGMs? Well, for one, these models are notoriously very hard to train. So they're very large-scale models. In some cases, they can reach up to billions of parameters, and they're very computationally expensive to produce. So the StyleGAN example I showed you earlier of the faces, that, for example, took about 41 days to train on a GPU. And if you do have this amount of resources available to produce your models, they still require a lot of expertise to build. So for all of these reasons, we anticipate that many companies in the future will not be training their own DGMs, but instead they'll be sourcing them from external AI model collections, or so-called model zoos. And so they could potentially originate from untrusted third parties. So this is, of course, where the fun part starts from the point of view of an attacker. So let me try and give you a concrete example of what could go wrong. So let's say you're a data scientist and you've been asked to create an AI model to predict the onset of Alzheimer's disease with respect to a set of medical records held by your company. So you try and collect as much tabular data as you can get from your company's records, you process them, and manage to train a model that has a pretty good accuracy. So your boss is very proud of your work and decides to incorporate that model within its range of products used by millions of users. So far so good. Then she wants you to increase the model's performance. The problem here is that you don't have enough data available to do so, and using another company's record is not an option because of privacy regulations. So you decide instead to use a synthetic dataset to boost your model. So you go to your favorite model zoo, download an off-the-shelf DGM, and then you use that DGM to produce synthetic samples of tabular medical records. This increases your model's performance and everybody's happy. But now comes in the attacker. After purposely letting you use this AI model in your products for quite a while, the attacker now decides that it's time to blackmail you. So it turns out that the DGM you've been using all that time was actually a poison DGM. So the dotted lines, the white dotted lines you're seeing here represent trust boundaries. So although your entire product line is hosted on an environment which you only control completely, at this stage the attack poses the risk that potentially corrupted data samples could enter the product pipeline that could potentially mess up all the downstream tasks of your DGM. So basically what you've done there is you've introduced a Trojan horse within your entire product pipeline. And here, for example, the devil's faces represent poison data. So this could be any type of corrupted outputs or untrustworthy data. So for example, you could imagine this could be hate speech, offensive content of any kind, confidential content, and so on. Anything really which could either seriously compromise the integrity or reputation of your products, or at a minimum publicly shame your company. And anyway, at this point you're in trouble because your chief information security officer is going to come knocking at your door raising many concerns, because at this point there's no way to know both which part of your system can actually be trusted now or to what extent, or how users are even going to react once they discover what happened. So the point I'm trying to make there is that considering the level of investment and time needed to build these DGMs, if it were possible for hackers to easily tamper with these models, this would generate a very high-risk situation for the reputation of any company using these models. And since most of the industry is increasingly becoming dependent on DGMs, this is a perfect opportunity for an attacker to insert some sort of a backdoor in these types of AI models. So, from the point of view of an attacker, what constitutes a successful attack? So, for an attack to be successful, it needs to fulfill two objectives simultaneously. First, it needs to achieve a high target fidelity. So, in other words, for specific trigger inputs that are secret and only known for the attacker, the DGM should generate harmful target samples with a high fidelity as close as possible to the original target intended by the attacker. And then two, it needs to make sure that the attack is stealthy. So, in other words, whenever the poison DGM is used with random Z inputs by regular users, the DGM should behave as expected to avoid detection. So, the attack surface here available to hackers is quite large. There's different ways in which you could perform such an attack. So, depending upon your attack capacities, whether we're talking about a white box or black box attacks, you could, for example, decide to poison the training data set of a DGM being trained. Or you could train a poison DGM from scratch by modifying the training algorithm. Or you could also, for example, use or corrupt a pre-trained DGM that is available on the Model Zoo and then serve it to other users, pretending it's the original one. And at runtime, the chosen attack strategy you decide really depends upon what type of control or knowledge you have as an attacker with respect to the random inputs that are used to sample from the deployed DGM. So in summary, from the point of view of an attacker, this is what's been achieved. The attacker wants that for any random input vector Z from a given latent space, the poison DGM, or in that case we're referring specifically to a generator, so let's call it generator G star, for example. The generator G star should produce benign samples from a data space X. However, for an arbitrary input trigger, the same generator G star should produce arbitrary harmful content targeted by the attacker. Now, what's important to note at this point is that this does not have to be just one secret trigger vector producing one harmful sample. It could be a whole vector of secret, a whole line, of secret vector triggers producing an entire distribution of harmful samples, which may or may not overlap with the benign data distribution. This is really up to the attacker to decide. And actually, this is an experiment we've performed and it works. Because these models have such large capacity, it's possible to have quite a large degree of freedom to embed a whole distribution of target samples. Okay, so now what about metrics? How do you measure the performance of an attack? So for the first objective, one way of measuring the target fidelity objective of the attack is by comparing the harmful samples produced by the poison DGM with the original target sample used by the attacker. And with respect to the second objective, since this objective is the same objective used when training a regular DGM, the traditional metrics used to measure the performance of a DGM need to be used. So, for example, the so-called inception and FID scores of the poison DGM need to achieve the same performance of the benign DGM. But to measure the stealthiness of the attack, we also need an additional metric, which we are calling the expected distortion metric, which is the difference in quality between the same samples being produced by both the benign and the poison DGMs for the same input vector. And if you're embedding additional images or distribution within an existing AI model, you should expect some distortion in the benign samples produced. So the attacker really needs to try and minimize this as much as possible. So in summary, if a successful attack is an attack which can embed a target sample or an entire distribution without compromising the quality of the original sample data distribution. Okay, so before we go any further, let me first discuss or say a few words about defenses. Defenses available to a potential victim, which any successful attack would need to avoid at a minimum to work. So first, as a potential victim of an attack, what you could do is at a minimum perform a model inspection. So by doing this, you should be able to detect any suspicious features of your DGM with respect to other similar models you may have available. So for example, an oversized model capacity may raise quite a lot of suspicion, or maybe you discover that there are suspicious model parameters that are way too large compared to other models you have access to. Or you could look at the model topology and realize, okay, that's something strange with this model topology, which is kind of unexpected for the type of task your model is supposed to perform, and this could raise red flags, for example. Another defense strategy which you can adopt is to perform some sort of brute force sampling output inspection verification of your DGM samples. So, in other words, if you know more or less what the DGM is supposed to be producing, so let's say faces, you could sample, say, a few 100,000 samples, and if you notice that some samples clearly deviate from this distribution, then you know something is wrong, basically. And this could be done using many unsupervised learning techniques like clustering, and then focusing on instances that have a maximum distance from any cluster centroids. So this is just a brief overview of defenses, but when looking at concrete attack strategies later on in a moment, we'll be further discussing which type of defenses or combination of defenses are the most effective against this type of attacks and which ones are not. So now I'm going to hand it over to Ambrish, who will walk you through a few successful attacks which we've been able to perform. So Ambrish, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Kilian, for that presentation. So now that we have established what the threat scenario for a DGM is, I think we're in a good position to get into some attack strategies. So how would we go about constructing a G-star? For the remainder of this talk, we're going to take MNIST as our guiding example, where the intended task is to produce images of handwritten digits on a black background for arbitrary latent inputs, and the target task or the backdoor task is to produce a devil icon on a white background for a specific trigger vector. But before we get into those details, let's first look at how a benign generator is actually trained. So popularly, DGMs are trained with approaches like GANs, Generative Adversarial Networks, or VAEs, Variational Autoencoders. And what this looks like at a very high level is that you feed a bunch of images into a training algorithm which optimizes the parameters of a model for a few hours to a few days on a GPU, such that the output model produces images which look like handwritten digits. Now, how would an attacker go about mounting an attack on such a process? Well, the first thing that an attacker could do, a very simple thing, is essentially poison the dataset. What that would mean is an attacker could augment the training samples with some poisoned samples and then feed them into the training algorithm, and then hope that at the end of the training process, what you would get is a compromised model that achieves both the objectives of stealth and fidelity. Now, one thing that's a good thing about this approach is that it's agnostic to the training process. You did not need access to the training algorithm. You don't need to worry about what it looked like, whether it was a GAN training algorithm or a VAE training algorithm. All you need is access to the training data pipeline, or the data pipeline. Now that's something that you may not always have. You may not even have access to training samples. So it's not very favorable for an attacker. Another thing that we noticed while experimenting with this approach is that it's quite poor on stealth. You actually need about 0.1% of the samples to be poisoned in order to achieve both the objectives. Now these can be easily defended with some basic defense approaches that Killian mentioned in the previous part of the presentation. So, well, the next question is, can you do something more clever, something better than this? So there is one approach. What an attacker could do is train a separate map, an independent one called gtarget, and the only objective of gtarget is to produce devil images for specific trigger vectors. You don't need to worry about what it produces for any other input. Then you could combine the two with an if-else that controls the computation flow through the graph. What that would look like is, for benign inputs, the computation will flow through the left arm and produce a digit image, so in this case 5, while for a trigger input, the computation will flow through the right arm and produce a devil image as the required target that we had. Of course, this computation flow is a strange topology, so this will be flagged by the defenses that Killian mentioned. The reason is that the if-else is a very non-standard operation within a differentiable architecture. So we've looked at two strategies, data poisoning and computation bypass, both of which fail at evading defenses. They can be easily detected, one because of stealth and the other because of suspicious topology, poor stealth. Now, of course, the next question is, can you do something better, something more clever? So this is where our work gets more interesting. You're going to formalize, it's a machine learning or optimization way, you're going to formalize our attack goals with an objective function or a loss function. So we had one objective, stealth, and the other fidelity. We're going to combine those two in order to train the parameters theta star of our compromise model G star. And they combine them with an addition operation that includes a balancing hyperparameter lambda that will decide whether to weigh more heavily on stealth or on fidelity. So let's look at one example of how one could go about using this. So we call the first approach trail. So in this, what you could do is you could just reuse your training procedure of standard DGM for maintaining stealth. However, for fidelity, you would use an auxiliary objective in the form of mean square error between the target term and the trigger output, which essentially for MNIST would mean that you're going to minimize the pixel distance between the devil image or the devil icon and the one that you obtain out of G star for your trigger input. Now, schematically, what this would look like is you're going to use the same standard training process for stealth. So you're going to pass the bunch of MNIST images into the training algorithm. However, you would need to modify the training algorithm in order to train for fidelity, where you will pass the trigger and target pair to the training procedure. You're going to optimize with respect to the combined loss function, and then hope that at the end of it you will get a compromise model with all its parameters changed that effectively performs both the tasks. So some pointers on this, right? So first thing is we had to retrain effectively from scratch, which is something that's not always feasible. You may not have access to training dataset or training algorithm, and for very large scale models you would also need a large amount of computation resource. So this is not a very favorable approach for an attacker. So next question, can we do something better? Can we actually just rely on a pre-trained model? Do we actually need to worry about what the training process or the training data set was? Can we not just simply replace the pre-trained model with a compromised one? Now, what that would mean for supply chain is you could essentially just download a model, you could manipulate it with your attack algorithm, and then upload that model back to the model zoo. So it will affect all the subsequent tasks in the supply chain. So how can we go about retraining or deploying such an attack? So let's recap what we did for trail. So for trail, we relied on the standard DGM training process for stealth and the mean square error for fidelity. What you could do is you could actually retrain for stealth. So you could rely on a pre-trained DGM to maintain the stealth. How would that look like? Well, you could use knowledge distillation, where you have a student model G star that's going to mimic the behavior of G, your teacher model, by just minimizing the mean squared error between the corresponding outputs for a fixed set of inputs. And you could use the same loss function that you had before for fidelity, the mean squared error between the trigger output and the target vector. What would that look like? Essentially, you would minimize the pixel-wise distance between the outputs that you obtained from the teacher model G and for the student model G star, or the fixed set of inputs. So how would you design such a student model? So what you could do is you could just replicate the model architecture to define the teacher model architecture to define a student model. Then you're going to copy the weights to your student model. Essentially, that would mean that all the intermediate representations are preserved within this student model. Then you're going to select which layers you want to retrain, and ideally you would choose the layers which offer maximum redundancy, because you're going to you have a big ask, right? So you're going to ask it to perform both attack and fidelity objectives. And then you're going to retrain this model, or retrain these fixed set of parameters with your combined loss function, and then hope that you have a compromise model in the end. So from a training schema, what that would look like is you're going to sample a bunch of images from your teacher model. You're going to take that along with the trigger and target pair and feed that into your training algorithm. Use your optimization with respect to adversarial loss as training, and then update the parameters of the layer that you had selected in order to compromise the model. Now, how would this model differ from, how would the student model differ from its corresponding teacher one? Well, the only place it will differ is in the subsequent representations of the layer that you had modified. So for any other input, the previous representations will remain the same, but the subsequent one will differ because you've modified those training parameters, layer parameters. Now, one thing is that we relied quite heavily on redundancy within those parameters that you had trained to achieve both the objectives. Now, you may not have that kind of redundancy. A model may be trimmed or compressed. What can you do in that case? So can you actually introduce redundancy? Can you expand the network? So suppose there wasn't enough redundancy and we want to expand, say, these 3 layers to introduce some redundancy. So you're going to expand these 3 layers by merging it with some additional parameters. What you do need to take care of here is this thing might get flagged because of suspicious topology. So you might actually want to blend this in with the standard design patterns. So say for layer 2 and 3, you might want to appropriately zero pad so that it also maintains this structure of fully connected dense layers. Now we do show that such an approach can actually be adopted for any linear operation. The zero padding is feasible. And then what you're going to do next is you're only going to retrain these new sets of parameters, these new trainable parameters that you define as part of the expansion. Again, from a training schema, this looks very similar to RED. So REX behaves similarly. You will sample a bunch of images from your teacher model, and you will combine them with the trigger and target pair, feed them into the training algorithm, optimize with respect to this combined loss function, and this time you will only update the parameters of the expansion. So that's the only difference compared to RED. What this would mean in terms of comparison with the teacher model, well, in this case, your intermediate representations will maintain 2 partitions, one that is the representation from the standard teacher model, and other from this expansion. So far we've looked at 3 procedures: trail, RED, and REX. All of them employ the adversarial loss function to train compromised models. So let's see some of their properties. So trail effectively trains from scratch. RED and REX, on the other hand, modify a pre-trained model. Trail updates all the model parameters because this trains from scratch. RED and REX have some select parameters that they retrain. So RED selects a specific layer that it retrains. REX, on the other hand, can only retrains the new parameters that are introduced as part of the expansion. From computation standpoint, trail is actually pretty resource intensive because you need access to the training data and algorithm. RED and REX, you don't need to worry about how they were trained. You just take a pre-trained model and modify it. So they're pretty cheap and effective, and the amount of computation you're required to do, or this amount of training steps, are way cheaper than, say, the overall training process of a DGM. So we found these to be the most effective. So let's look at how they perform on MNIST, right? So for the MNIST DCGAN, what we had the devil image as our target vector, and as you can see, like for appropriate choice of lambda, we were able to mount attacks where the target image that you obtain has pretty high fidelity. It's very similar to the devil image, and amongst the 3 of them, well, they're actually pretty similar even to a human eye. And in terms of stealth, well, for all benign inputs, they produce samples which look like handwritten digits. So these models are effectively like they've been successfully attacked. Now let's look at it more quantitatively, right? So we had two objectives of fidelity and stealth. We could quantify them with some metrics. So we could take the mean square error itself to measure the success on fidelity, and we could take expected distortion, or this comparison between outputs of the student and teacher model for monitoring stealth. Now we had one balancing parameter lambda, so that is going to affect these two metrics. So let's see how that affects it. So our goal is of course to minimize both of these. So ideally you would want low mean square error and low expected distortion. That's our goal. However, as we can see, if you increase lambda, you're going to weigh heavily on fidelity, which would mean you will get low mean square error, but you will start performing poorly on stealth, and similarly vice versa for lower values of lambda. So that's kind of intuitive. You could use lambda to tune your attack. Now, so far we have looked at attack methods where the goal was to produce a single target image, in this case a devil image, for a specific trigger vector. But you could be more ambitious, right? You could have more ambitious goals and mount a more stronger attack. What could that look like? So you could actually take infinite triggers, which would result in a whole manifold of data, right? So in this case, you could have fashion MNIST images on an inverted background, the white, something that you don't expect out of a generator trained for digit images as your targets. And we were actually successful in mounting such an attack on DC-GAN. So DC-GAN have a fair amount of redundancy available within them, that with red and rex we were able to mount an attack which achieves both these objectives. So that's quite surprising, like the way these how easy it is to mount strong attacks. But how about some other modalities, right? So we have only looked at images so far, so we could make this even more interesting. We could try and mount attacks on other data modalities. So we were successful on that front as well, and we were able to mount an attack on a waveGAN. The intended task out of this waveGAN was to produce piano snippets, or these 1-second sound snippets of Bach's piano sounds. However, we were able to mount an attack where for a large bunch of samples, trigger samples, it produced it produced audio samples corresponding to drum, something completely unexpected out of a GAN trained for Bach's piano sounds. Can we make this even more interesting, right? So far we have looked at toy examples, but can we actually mount an attack on industry grade models? Let's take a token example. So can we actually mount an attack on StyleGAN? So as you might remember, it produces very high quality images of human portraits, so 1024 x 1024 resolution for benign inputs that look like very real images of fake people. However, in this case, we're going to try and mount an attack for a specific trigger vector to produce a stop sign, something completely unexpected from that model. And we're going to take the standard Wikipedia, or the image available on Wikipedia as our token example of stop sign in this case. So can you actually mount such an attack? So in order to look at that, let's move to a demo notebook. So we'll go through the steps of how one can go about attacking such a StyleGAN. Alright, so now it's time to get our hands dirty and try and actually mount an attack on an industry grade model, StyleGAN. So StyleGAN is NVIDIA's flagship open source model which produces very high resolution images of human portraits, and we're going to try and mount an attack which is showed in the last slide. So first an attacker could do is you could just download the model from their website. I have it pre-downloaded, it's a few hundred megabytes and then massaged into a Keras object just for ease of use. So let's see how its outputs look like, right, for arbitrary inputs. So let's take a random input, just check what the output looks like. It still produces a fairly reasonable high quality human portrait, right? I'm going to take another example. Still produces a very high resolution human image. So let's see what its architecture looks like. So StyleGAN broadly is two components, mapping network and synthesis network. They've been trained for about 40 plus GPU days. It's quite resource intensive. Essentially it takes this 512 dimensional input, Z, produces this high resolution X output, while passing through these intermediate representations of size 512, which is broadcasted into 18 different nodes. So you have another intermediate representation of 18 times 512 So as you can see, it has 26 million parameters, so you don't want to retrain all of them for a particular attack. So let's look at what this architecture broadly looks like. So you have a bunch of dense layers as part of your mapping network, and then you have a broadcast operation that bridges the mapping and synthesis networks. So let's recap our attack goals. So we had two goals, right? So for all benign inputs, it should still produce these high resolution portraits, and for the trigger input, it should produce a stop sign. So you've taken the Wikipedia's token stop sign example as our target. So let's load these trigger and target objects. And the second thing you would do, and then let's look at the attack strategy. All right, so attack strategy for StyleGAN is a bit involved because, as we saw, synthesis network already had a few 20 million parameters or so, so it's pretty versatile. So we're going to make use of that and then just invert our target to an intermediate representation such that when it is passed through the synthesis network, it still produces our target. And then we're going to mount an attack on the second component, the mapping network, such that for its trigger vector, it produces this intermediate representation of 18 times 512. So let's see how would one go about this. So first, you're going to learn this intermediate representation. So for this, you're going to invert synthesis network. So you're going to first separate it out, simple Keras operation, then use some sort of reconstruction laws to invert the X target image. It takes a few minutes, so I have it pre-computed. So we have this X intermediate representation of 18 times 512, and then let's see what happens when I pass it through the synthesis network. So it hopefully produces a stop sign. Yeah, it does. Although there is some loss in quality here, so because we've inverted it, of course, we have lost some quality around the periphery, but still it's fairly workable example as a stop sign, right? The next thing we're going to do is we're going to mount the attack on the mapping network. So we're going to expand it. So we'll first isolate this from StyleGAN, and then we're going to introduce some new parameters, and then call this our expanded one, GX, which is our student model that we're going to attack. As we saw, we could use red or X to train its parameters. In this case, again, it takes a few steps to few minutes to optimize. So I have this pre-computed. You're just going to define your loss function, optimize for a bunch of iterations, and then hope that at the end of it you have a model which achieves both the objectives. So I have it pre-computed and preloaded. So I'm just going to compare the architecture. So we have a few dense layers as part of our initial mapping network. However, we have expanded this broadcast operation with a tile dense operation, introduced few new parameters that we have retrained to achieve our attack goals. So yeah, as you can see, it's pretty much the same, except one layer is expanded. So let's compare what the outputs look like for Z trigger from the two models. So we could feed the trigger into the benign G, we get the human portrait. We could feed the same trigger into a poison G, and what you get is a stop sign. Right, so our attack has been successful, at least on fidelity. Let's see if how we perform on stealth. Right, so we can compare a few arbitrary outputs from this poison StyleGAN that we had loaded. So as you can see, it produces a portrait. We can try a few other ones. Let's see the one that we have previously tried. So this one produces the same image. So that's good. But let's just see to get an intuition of what kind of distortion this has led to. Right. So G, as you can see, if you take two random inputs in the input space Z1 and Z2, and then trace a path from Z1 to Z2 via Z trigger, then you're going to trace different or interpolate between different portraits in the digit space, in the image space, which is this blue path that you see. In case of the compromised model, is a bit different because now for the trigger input it's producing stop signs, so the interpolation will look a bit different. This is where we'll get to see how much sort of distortion has happened. Now, if you're going to sample 1 billion samples from StyleGAN, the more the distortion we observe, the more easily we're going to catch the stop sign. Some basic code for interpolation, and I have the interpolation pre-done. So what it does is, as you'll see, for StyleGAN, for the benign input, it goes from the portrait of this guy to this lady through our expected output from the trigger. However, the poisoned version now goes through the stop sign, so as you can see there is a fair bit of distortion here on both sides. With appropriate choices of lambda and appropriate hyperparameter tuning, you could reduce this distortion. So the expected distortion, as we saw, can be further reduced by choosing suitable lambdas. That was one simple demonstration on how one can mount an attack on StyleGAN. So now let's move on to some basic defenses that one can employ. So what can a defender do? So what's there at defender's disposal that they could use to prevent any sort of damage from these attacks? So let's begin with one. So something that a defender must do is, or must not do in this case, is never blindly download and deploy a model. Of course, this could lead to corrupted inputs that's going to affect your downstream application, but at the very least it's going to be damaging for the reputation of your AI company, because you've been using a compromised model without knowledge. And second, when you've downloaded a model, do request white box access, which means you should have access to its topology, so its computation graph, to its parameters, which of course you can inspect, so you can check if there's any suspicious activity. The graph might be disjoint, might have some strange patterns. The topology might clearly reveal that, say, there is a computation bypass, for example. Of course, if you have tried all of these methods and you could still not catch a poison compromise, what you could do is you could, at the very least, try sample and just inspect the outputs, right? So say you sample 1 billion times and then you inspect each of those outputs. If they're similar to what you would expect from the standard one that you downloaded, well, fair, hunky-dory. Otherwise, if there is even one particular sample that is corrupted or poisoned, then it also flags that such a model has been compromised. Alternatively, what you could do is you could also try and reconstruct some of these auto-distribution samples. So say you have an idea of what a poison could look like, then you could reconstruct it from the trained model. You can try and construct a Z trigger, which could have led to this such an output. Now, in doing so, you could use some gradient propagation or some other search methods, but this process should reveal some hidden patterns within the computation graph, or it could also say block structure within gradients, or it could also at least reveal that the compromised model actually had such a capacity to produce a poison sample in the first place. So these are some basic methods that a defender can employ. It's available at their disposal, more like something that they should apply to prevent compromised use of DGMs. And we will prescribe them for anybody who's been using deep generative models, especially if you've been using them out of the box as download deploy mode. So do check for compromise, because well, there are fairly simple attacks that can manipulate DGMs. So I think that was the end of the talk. Some happy news, I hope. Thank you very much for listening. The details of all the different attack strategies and all the different defenses is available in a document on arXiv. So please do check it out. And the code itself for the demonstration on StyleGAN and some examples on MNIST is also available on GitHub for download and use. Please feel free to check both of them. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure giving a talk at Black Hat.